This is Talking About the School to Prison Pipeline by Rachel Duncan, Ben Rush, and Libby Turner.
So, what is the school to prison pipeline? Basically, the school to prison pipeline is just the manner through which students who are most often minorities, such as African American or the learning disabled, go from being students in the traditional school setting to entering a prison as young adults due to early criminalization and suspension.
So, as we're talking about the school to prison pipeline, and as we look at these categories of those that are mostly affected by this, it's best understood from this graph below. You can tell that the graph is separated between boys and girls, and how also there is a higher percentage of students that are of African American, and with boys being 20% African American and girls 12%. Those numbers actually represent in school suspensions, or out of school suspensions. And one of the things we'll be discussing is how that actually can be a contributor to criminalizing students and contributing to the school to prison pipeline. You can also notice on the graph that if you look at the American Indian and Alaska Native, the population between boys and girls, that also represents a higher percentage of out-of-school suspensions. Another concern is even with Hispanic populations. But ultimately, one of the biggest issues you can see in this graph is, or this bar diagram, you can see that there is a low white percentage for boys and girls being suspended from school. So, as we look at data on disciplinary actions in school and on students, one of the things we need to look at is how disciplinary actions as a whole has affected students. And this was actually taken from an article from a Texas study, actually, from a Texas State Court website. And you can see on this graph that students that were that actually faced disciplinary actions, that 31% of them actually repeated a grade at least once, compared to students with no disciplinary actions. 5% they actually did. The 5% repeated a grade at least once. And then if you look to the right, you can see that 10% of the students that faced disciplinary actions actually dropped out of school, while 2% also of the students that faced no disciplinary actions dropped out of school. So one of the big ideas from this data here is that there is a high percentage of those repeating grades and dropping out of school due to disciplinary actions, and these disciplinary actions can be a result from the school to prison pipeline. Out of school suspensions is what was talked about earlier, and there actually will be some more data to talk about this, but it just kind of provides a general idea of where what students, what their outcome is as a result of disciplinary action. So this is something that needs to be considered when talking about the school to prison pipeline. Okay, so here we look at, on this slide, on disciplinary data on race and gender. And this is the same diagram. This diagram is from the same study that was done in the Texas study. So we have 4 different sets of bar graph data. If you look to the left, there is a data representing male and female students of different racial populations, and this is focusing on discretionary disciplinary violation. And you can see that there is a higher percentage of African American students, both male and females, that were placed under the population for discretionary disciplinary violation, which ultimately this conveys information that the teacher focuses on disciplinary action due to their own discretion. So that means that there's kind of a broad interpretation there of what should be disciplined and what should not be disciplined. And if you look to the far right, you can see that there is data on juvenile justice system contact, which may in turn be a result from this disciplinary violations. You can see that there is a higher percentages of African American male and female students that are coming into contact with the juvenile justice system. And ultimately, you can see that white populations as a whole had the lower populations. So you can see that there is evidence, according to these studies, that there are racial disparities amongst disciplinary actions and juvenile justice system contacts, and how this ultimately can result in problems with the school to prison pipeline. One example we need to look at here is how this was actually a real thing that happened. If you looking at racial disparities, there was actually a lawsuit filed against a town in Mississippi, Meridian, Mississippi, and they federal civil rights attorney filed this lawsuit against the town due to there was a higher number of African American students in the schools that were being punished and actually being charged and sentenced. But one of the problems faced with this was the violation of constitutional rights, which actually led to the lawsuit filing. It was a big contributor. Students were not allowed certain rights. The protocol for placing charges and sentencing students was not handled in the correct way. Due process was a big thing that wasn't handled in the correct way. So this is one example of how there is racial disparities, and how ultimately, you can see here that African American students were it seems like they were almost targeted in this example. So this is a very big legal issue that is happening. Another contributor to the school to prison pipeline is there's more pronounced presence of SRO officers in the school. According to one article I read, there was 92,000 arrests in 2011 and 2012 during the school year. SROs seem to be implemented. There was the tragedy at Columbine High School. And this kind of led to more of their presence to try to promote a safe learning environment and safety for the students. However, a big problem with this is that it's just leaving a lot of the discipline to rest in the hands of SRO officers. And it's ultimately contributing to students entering juvenile justice systems and causing them to have a record, an actual juvenile record on them.
So, some of the causes of the school to prison pipeline include zero tolerance laws and the implementation of these SROs in the schools. Zero tolerance occurred after a law in 1994 to stop gun violence outside of and within schools. However, this law ultimately led to, as it allowed for suspensions due to bringing in any type of gun or weapon, it led to higher suspension rates in students for minor infractions, and ultimately caused a lot of students to be suspended for things they really should not have been suspended for. And once a student is suspended, they're sent out into the world back home to get into more trouble without supervision, especially if there isn't a parent at home, which might lead to local law enforcement at home. So these zero tolerance laws, when implemented in the school, really caused harm for students who were held accountable for things they really shouldn't have been held accountable for. And then the implementation of the SROs in schools cause discipline to be pushed more on the local law enforcement, these officers who are within the school, instead of discipline being enacted by teachers and administration of the school. And this isn't necessarily desired because it relies so much on the local and state governments, and inevitably leads students to be put in contact with local law enforcement and governments in the juvenile system before they've even exited the school. And when a student is put into contact with the juvie system, they're exponentially more likely to be later in contact with the prison system, ultimately. Another cause of the school to prison pipeline could be the high stakes testing for many high schoolers and their exit exams. According to one article that I read, it said that many teachers will have their students. It said that many teachers will kind of push their students to drop out before, even if they see that student is struggling, to drop out before they've even taken an exam, so that the averages of these benchmark tests and exit exams will be higher overall. This is probably a more rare case, but it does happen, and it should be known that this happens. And then also, some students will take their exit exams or just a benchmark exam, do very poorly or fail it, and decide on their own that they're going to drop out. And this ultimately pushes them back out into society, where they don't have the supervision that they need, and they're not learning how to be good citizens within the school setting, and gets them into trouble that if they did not have to be put under the pressure of an exam, they may not have had to go through.
So the next thing that kind of is another contributor to this is the child's background, ecological background, socioeconomic. I think it first starts at home. Whatever the child's norms are, as far as it being, like if they're around a lot of violence, if they're around a lot of family members or friends or whatever their community base is, really, that could contribute a lot to whether or not they're going to be having a lot of vision for their life outside of their community that they're in. Because oftentimes this is kind of a generational thing, not just isolated to one incident, which it can be, but in a lot of these cases, this is very much through the generations. So I think first it starts at home, and a lot of it too kind of ties back to one of my developmental psychology classes, and it was talking about just how a kid can sometimes have a hard time determining between fantasy and reality, even tied to video games, like violence in a video game. And for a child who is in an abusive home or has a community that's tended towards violence, it can be hard for that student to play violent video games and to see that as just that's not just fantasy to them, that's reality. But for a student who comes from a home where violence is not present, and loving home, and parents are of a certain socioeconomic class and all that, that can very easily see the video game as fantasy. So I think that it first starts at home, and seeing the community of if it's normal for people around you to be going to prison or violence or drugs or alcohol or really what have you. It just kind of depends on that child's community base. And then the second thing is of the school that they're in, and just kind of what is the atmosphere of the school. So if that kind of is the teachers are building community relationships and good relationships with their students, and having them be able to say, hey, I'm having a problem, I'm failing this class, or it's related to this, or if there's a student that's acting out behaviorally, the teacher should hopefully take an interest in that student and be able to say, what's going on? I know this is not you. What's going on in your home, in your friend's life, in your school life, like, let me help you. But unfortunately, that's often not the case. So this can kind of contribute to the influx of the school to prison pipeline. So some of the strategies to avoid this is in the systemic. This could be like increasing the positive behavior of interventions and supports in the school, and so that can be both academically and emotional support, and then also compiling a lot of reports and data points tied to that student's actions and behaviors, so that we can kind of keep track of where that student is historically, where they've been. If it's a bigger school system, obviously this is going to be a lot more difficult to kind of consistently tie all the pieces together and get to know that student. But no matter what school, hopefully we are going to be learning to be very intentional about our students. Even if we only see them for 30 minutes a day, we just really need to make sure that we are building those connections with them. And then also creating agreements with police departments and court systems to limit the arrests at school and the use of restraints, like mace and handcuffs and other things like that. It's really important that the quote unquote punishment fits the crime, as far as, you don't want to alienate your student even further away from you. If they're acting out in class being disrespectful, that is a far cry away from like making threats against you or threats against other students, or other kinds of harassment, or breaking the law, like bringing drugs or alcohol or weapons to school. So just making sure that we're kind of keeping it within reason and appropriate for that student, both age-wise and actions. And that kind of goes into the next one, is just like providing simple explanations of infractions and prescribed responses of the student of code of conduct to ensure fairness. So we always want to like talk to the student and like hear them out as to what's going on, and not that they can explain away why, and not that an explanation justifies all their actions, but I do think that goes a long way in building trust. And then also creating appropriate boundaries and appropriate limits of the use of law enforcement in public schools. So not kind of what I said before, just like not kind of flying off the handle and getting an officer when a student's being disrespectful, and kind of overreacting to just get the student to stop. Like, we do have to maintain control in the class, but it also has to be done within reason. And that kind of goes into training your teachers and letting them know how to use positive behavior supports, like the PBIS, just knowing like the positive behavior and knowing how to reinforce that and create an environment where that is a norm, that is the regular. And then getting to know your students and loving them well. This has to be done on a consistent basis above all. You can't just be sporadic and moody. Like one of the biggest things just in life of kindness is being consistently kind even when you don't feel like it. And so I think that kind of crosses over obviously to all areas of life, not just this instance, but I think that kind of goes hand in hand with also discipline. And discipline doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing of like a consequence, but it could be discipline like you're training for a race. You're training yourself to care for your students really well, but also caring for them by giving them lots of boundaries so they know where you stand. They don't have to question like, oh, does my teacher, like, are they mad at me today, or are they happy with me this day, or whatever. It is a discipline to consistently be kind and consistently admit when you're wrong, like on the teacher. As a teacher, I hope someday to be able to say, hey, I was really short with you in this instance, and I was really either harsh, or I just made a mistake, and that I didn't realize X, Y, and Z had happened, so I really just needed to I didn't make the best decision for you, and I'm sorry. And I think that kind of goes a long way to like building the trust before. So, and also knowing when to get help with the school counselors and some of the administration. Like when the teacher, like for, I'm sure the first 10 years of my career, if not longer, and I hope for my lifelong career, to be able to go and ask for help of the administration and to admit when I just don't know what to do, and just seek help and seek advice as to how to best help the students, because it's ultimately just about supporting them, making sure that they feel cared for, loved, supported, and ultimately just supported in their life and set up to have a very long, successful life themselves.